Hello and very warm welcome to all of you in this edition of Public Forum. I'm Anurag Punita with you. Secretary Blinken's visit to India and his meetings with India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and later Prime Minister Modi has sent all the right signals to the world and especially to those who were expecting some chinks in the armor of the outcome of this meeting like human rights issues. Secretary Blinken said not only did not say on human rights issues but also urged that one of the elements Americans admire most is fundamental freedom and human rights, and that is how US defines India. He further said India's democracy is powered by free-thinking citizens, so in fact both nations have come closer than ever before. One of the key takeaways from this meeting and this visit is both sides agreed that violence or a power grab in Afghanistan will not lead to stability there. Both nations discussed strategic issues of importance in security, defense, economic and tech-related sectors. And one of the important things that happened during this visit that India convinced US not to broach some niggling issues but also made US convinced to have a meeting with a representative of the Dalai Lama, Tibetan spiritual leader, a move that has provoked anger in China. And this meeting was one of the most conspicuous contact between US and Tibetan officials since President Barack Obama met Dalai Lama in Washington in 2016. Despite the gentle pushback on some issues, sources said there was a considerable convergence on Afghanistan and Tibetan and Taliban actions over the past few months. The US side, so said, assessed that the violence is not a route to stability in Afghanistan. Blinken also gave hint that if Taliban wants legitimacy throughout the world as a government, only US can give that. So they have to follow some routine and some peace talk agreements. To understand all these details, I have been joined by Mr. Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director, Asia Program, South Asia Senior Associate at the Wilson Center in Washington. I spoke to him a little while ago.
Yeah, Michael, I mean, to begin with, should I be asking that Secretary of State Anthony Blinken emphasize the shared values of India and the US as the two democracies? And he also said that there is a greater imperative than ever on cooperation, coordination, and collaboration among the India and US. What do you like to say about this visit and the context and content of the joint statement by both the ministers and state secretary?
Well, I think one of the luxuries of a relationship that's quite healthy and robust, like the U.S.-India relationship, is that there's never going to be a shortage of substantive issues to discuss whenever you have a high-level engagement like the one that we had with Secretary Blinken's visit. Certainly, he came to India at a very significant time in a geopolitical context. The U.S., of course, is focused laser-like on its withdrawal from Afghanistan, so the Afghanistan issue was clearly an area of focus during Blinken's meetings. The pandemic is still very much on everyone's minds, certainly in Washington, certainly in New Delhi, and I think it's notable that really the one substantive announcement or initiative to come out of these meetings was this new $25 million pandemic assistance package to India from the United States, which I think is significant. Of course, the China factor loomed large. I think it's quite notable that both U.S. and Indian relations with China remain ice cold. And that's been the case for quite some time. Both countries have experienced major tensions with China, so clearly that was something to be discussed as well. And I think also, final point is, I imagine that there's just a lot of activity, a lot of high-level activity coming up in the months ahead for U.S.-India relations, including perhaps an in-person Quad meeting in Washington, as well as potentially a separate bilateral visit from Prime Minister Modi. So I imagine that Secretary Blinken in his discussions engage in some talks about preparing for some major forthcoming high-level meetings in the coming months. So really all good. I imagine there weren't all that many difficult discussions. So it seems to me that it was a very successful visit, as was expected.
Last time when Foreign Minister Jaishankar visited US, one section of the media termed it as a damn prescribe. I mean, there was no concrete and tangible outcome that point of time. So in that way, if you like to compare both the visits, is that a successful one? Can we say that?
Well, I think they were both successful. I think that the Jaishankar visit here was much less public. I think that the idea there, I mean, as you would recall, of course, India at that time was very much suffering from the COVID-19 surge, and I think that for Dr. Jaishankar, one of the objectives of that visit was simply to meet with as many folks that he could, including those in the private sector, to discuss cooperation and helping India tackle its pandemic. And so I think for political reasons, I think it was important for New Delhi to try to keep things behind the scenes, have the high-level meetings, but the main focus had to be on the pandemic. But now things have changed a little bit, and I think that with this visit with Secretary Blinken, there was a desire on both sides to have things more in the public eye. But, final point, I feel that oftentimes there are these sky-high expectations of every time you have a high-level visit in the U.S.-India relationship. There seems to always be some type of expectation for some type of big announcement. And, it's perfectly possible to have a successful meet where you don't have some type of splashy takeaway or headline. That did happen in this case because of this new pandemic assistance package. But I think it's perfectly fine just to have a series of high-level exchanges that don't yield any type of major announcement. I think that just having those sustained high-level engagements is an indication of the good health of the relationship.
Both the minister talked about the cooperation, coordination between the two nations. They talked about how to fight combined the pandemic as well. They talked about the Indo-Pacific. They talked about Afghanistan. So in that way, and in fact, Secretary Blinken also agreed to meet a representative of Dalai Lama. This optic, how would you like to describe?
Yeah, that was quite significant. Clearly, I think it's another reflection of the fact that the Biden administration is really not concerned about antagonizing China, so to speak. There have been a lot of questions about the Biden administration coming in if it would maintain this tough, hard line vis-a-vis China as the Trump administration had. But I think we've seen that the Biden administration is not afraid to send tough messages to China. And you'll recall that right from the start, the administration sent a very strong signal to China when it invited the Taiwan de facto ambassador in Washington, essentially the highest-ranking official in the highest-ranking Taiwanese official in the U.S., to President Biden's inauguration. That had never happened before. And then the fact that several months ago, the top U.S. Asia official, Kirk Campbell, he essentially said that the era of engagement with China is over, which is a pretty strong statement. He basically depicted the relationship with China as a competition, and I think that in that context, the fact that Secretary Blinken had this meeting with this representative in India it's sort of following that same trend. And again, I think it amplifies how significant a role the China factor plays in the U.S.-India relationship. And the fact that, again, as I said before, both the U.S. and India are experiencing tensions with China on levels that they have not in many years.
Secretary also said that if Taliban wants legitimacy, they have to stick to the rule of law. In fact, what sort of this messages would convey a clear-cut signal to Taliban as well after withdrawing from Afghanistan? How would you like to describe this statement?
It was a significant statement, and I had tweeted about this that typically the U.S. and its messaging about the Taliban and legitimacy, it basically says that if you seize power by force, you're going to lose your legitimacy. But I had never heard a U.S. official say if you keep carrying out these brutalities and atrocities, you're going to lose legitimacy. I think that was important, and I imagine that was a message that was well received by his Indian guests too. I think that. India has conveyed, for good reason, that it is very concerned about what is happening in Afghanistan, and particularly the fact that the Taliban continues to engage in these increasingly high levels of violence without any indication that there's going to be any type of violence reduction. These are the same concerns of the United States, but until now, the U.S. hadn't really come down hard on the Taliban in that way. And I think it's important to recognize that we could talk about all the shared interests between the U.S. and India, but I do think Afghanistan is one area where there are a number of differences. I know that the U.S. is withdrawing and it wants to have the different sides in Afghanistan work out some type of political settlement that, if successful, would result in the Taliban sharing a degree of power. Whereas, of course, for India, that's a more difficult pill to swallow. And so I do think that one of the objectives of this visit by Secretary Blinken is to discuss with his Indian hosts how to figure out outcomes or potential policies, objectives in Afghanistan where the U.S. and India can see eye to eye and work together. And I do think that one area specifically is in these growing efforts of regional diplomacy around Afghanistan to build some type of consensus for the way forward in Afghanistan. Most of Afghanistan's neighbors are rivals of the United States: Iran, Russia, China, or they're difficult partners like Pakistan or Turkey or Saudi Arabia. India is an exception. It's a close friend of the US's, and I think Washington would like to see India, as a friend of the US, step up its role in these regional diplomatic efforts vis-a-vis Afghanistan. And we've already started to see that happen in recent weeks, such as when we had Dr. Jaishankar's participation in these meetings on Afghanistan in Central Asia.
China is also trying to make a ties with the Taliban and probably warming ahead of the US leaving Afghanistan. What impact it would have on the geostrategic balance in this part of the world?
Well, I imagine that the U.S. recognizes that it's inevitable that all of these players around Afghanistan's neighbors, are going to try to engage more with the Taliban. I mean, everyone recognizes the fact that once the withdrawal is complete, no matter what happens in Afghanistan, the Taliban is going to get even stronger, and it'll have a good chance to hold power either through a negotiation or, unfortunately, more likely, perhaps through continuing to fight and seizing power. So I think that all of these countries, China and others, they want to ramp up their relations with the Taliban. And of course, as you know, India itself recently sought for the first time to formally open up channels of communication with the Taliban. So given that all of Afghanistan's neighbors are rivals of the U.S., it's inevitable that strategically the U.S. is going to see some disadvantageous outcomes emerging, in the sense that many of its rivals are going to deepen its influence in the Afghanistan picture.
Will Taliban be different in any way what they were in the late 90s?
Well, I have no reason to believe that they would be different. I mean, you could highlight superficial differences, such as the fact that Taliban leaders, they use cell phones and they're willing to have pictures taken of themselves. They're willing to be, talking with female journalists, things like that. But I think that's all very superficial. If you look at the evidence, which basically is areas of Afghanistan that are currently under Taliban control, how do things look there? And they don't look good based on the researchers and the journalists that have been in these Taliban-controlled areas. It's quite clear that you have many examples of the Taliban using the same type of draconian justice system and the same cases of severely curtailing the public role of women, the same types of things you had during the Taliban emirate of the 1990s. And that's clearly not a good sign. And I think that for the U.S. and its partners, the question comes down to the legitimacy issue here, that if it's really true that the Taliban values its legitimacy that it's earned from the U.S. and other countries after it signed its deal with the U.S. last year, that it would not want to essentially seize power by force and reinstitute this draconian political system. If that's true, great. But I don't know. I mean, the Taliban has not necessarily acted in recent months like it really cares a whole lot about its legitimacy. It's not been willing to reduce violence at all. It's been carrying out some very terrible atrocities, to put it mildly, as we know. It's an open secret that it's been behind many of these target killings in Afghanistan, targeting civil society. So I think that simple answer to your question is, unfortunately, I don't think the Taliban has changed, except on very superficial levels that at the end of the day are insignificant.
Okay, given the fact that Taliban's history, they have started killing journalists, comedians, and civil society members as well. The people are fleeing from Afghanistan. But as for the US is concerned, US left this option of bombing certain areas of Taliban if they don't follow the peace process. But can we say, or can I ask that, is US game over in Afghanistan or not, as per your understanding?
Well, honestly, I think the US government has been so focused on the operational aspects of the withdrawal that there really hasn't been all that much thinking on policy levels about what it will be doing in Afghanistan after it leaves, beyond continuing to provide financial assistance to the security forces and trying to back the diplomatic process attached to the inter-Afghan dialogue. My sense is that the US will be very focused on trying to maintain some semblance of a counterterrorism capacity in Afghanistan. So I think that what we will see are efforts to surveil, monitor the movement of terrorists, and perhaps even to use airstrikes to target terrorists. But as you know, it's going to be hard to do that because as of now, the U.S. will have to depend on existing military facilities in the Gulf, in the Middle East. It had been looking for opportunities to conclude agreements with bordering states, to have new basing arrangements, which would make it a lot easier to carry out these counterterrorism activities. But it hasn't been successful in that regard. I don't think that the U.S. would actually change course and send troops back to Afghanistan if the Taliban insurgency continues to get stronger. President Biden made his decision to leave Afghanistan based on what he perceived to be a relatively weak terrorism threat in Afghanistan vis-a-vis the United States. In other words, he concluded that the terrorism threat in Afghanistan to the United States beyond Afghanistan was not strong enough to warrant troops staying. So this is why, it's the optics are bad, but the Taliban insurgency has been getting worse. It's been seizing all this territory. The U.S. has been intensifying its withdrawal because its withdrawal is not tied at all to the fate of the insurgency. It's tied to perceived capacities and strength of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In terms of whether the U.S. is getting out of the game, I think on a military level, generally it is, though it will try to focus on these counterterrorism activities. But I do think that it'll try to maintain the training and advising mission of Afghan security forces as it can through perhaps meeting with Afghan soldiers in third countries or having conversations with them remotely. Obviously, that's no substitute for doing it in Afghanistan in person, but I think that's what it's come down to at this point.
My final question to you: you said that probably India should open a channel to have the discussion or the dialogue with the Taliban as well. Would that be practical and feasible in coming time, or because there were reports that Indian government tried to negotiate Taliban in Doha as well?
Yeah, I think the big question is how the Taliban has responded or will respond to this outreach. It's not clear to me that the Taliban has been receptive to a substantive engagement with the Taliban, with India. I mean, my sense is that from India's perspective, it does make a lot of sense to try to do this, just because, I think at a very basic level, India will need to try to do everything possible to ensure the security of its personnel in India and its assets or its investments. As you know, India has made a lot of investments in Afghanistan over the years, and it's built and financed a number of things, including a dam that was targeted by the Taliban not too long ago. So I think that at a very minimum level, it makes sense for the Indians to try to engage with the Taliban in order to gain some type of understanding from the Taliban that the Taliban will not try to shoot at or attack Indian interests or Indians in Afghanistan. But I'm skeptical, given the incredibly different, the huge differences between the Taliban and the Indian state, ideologically, among other things. To me, it seems hard to believe that the Taliban would be willing to see India as a friend or even as a potential partner in negotiations.
Even if Taliban willing, will the ISI or the Pakistan will let it happen?
Yeah, I imagine that while Pakistan has been relatively quiet publicly about this news of these attempted outreaches to the Taliban from India, clearly this is not something that Pakistan wants to happen. And I imagine that Pakistan would worry that if this succeeds, that India could succeed in driving a wedge between Pakistan and its most important assets in Afghanistan, which clearly would be a major problem for the Pakistanis. But I imagine that the Pakistanis also assume, like I just said, that the prospects of a substantive or successful engagement between the Taliban and New Delhi are quite unlikely. But I would not be surprised if Pakistan has encouraged the Taliban not to take too seriously those engagements from the Indians. But one thing we've seen with the Taliban in Pakistan is that Pakistan could well say things to the Taliban and encourage it to do certain things. the Taliban doesn't necessarily have to listen if it doesn't think that those things would be in their interest. Certainly, Pakistan, as we know, has a fair amount of leverage over the Taliban because of the safe havens it provides to the leadership, the medical facilities it provides to wounded Taliban fighters and all. But the Taliban, and one thing we've learned is it's got a lot of strength, it's got a lot of confidence, it's going to do what it wants to do, and it's not necessarily going to be deterred or dissuaded by those, including the Pakistanis that talk to it. So in other words, I don't think we should overstate the ability of Pakistan to essentially dictate to the Taliban what it does or does not do. I imagine the Taliban will make a decision on its own in which it concludes that it doesn't really make sense to have a deep relationship with India, unless it concludes that for the legitimacy factor, it needs to make a show of engaging with all types of different actors, including those that it has nothing in common with. That's another factor to consider.
Okay. On this note, I have to wrap up the show. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining me. It's indeed a pleasure to have you in the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So that was Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director, Asia Program, South Asia Senior Associate at the Wilson Center, Washington. So Secretary Blinken's visit can be termed as a successful one. Both nations ironed out some differences and developed convergence on global issues and avoided some prickling issues. And how India and US now counters China and new regime in Afghanistan would be a challenge for both the nations. And there are no favorable situations for both the nations and both the countries in this part of the world. That's all we have in this edition of Public Forum. Thank you very much for watching.